Jake Harrison pressed his face against the small window of the transport ship and watched as Kepler Station grew larger in the darkness of space. The massive structure looked like a metal city floating among the stars, with bright lights marking countless windows and docking bays. He had never seen anything so huge in his 19 years of life on Earth. The transport ship shuddered as it connected to the station's docking arm. Jake grabbed his small bag and joined the line of beings walking toward the exit. Most of them were not human. He saw tall blue creatures with 4 arms, small green beings with big eyes, and others that looked like walking rocks. They all seemed to know where they were going, but Jake felt lost and nervous. "First time at the academy?" asked a voice behind him. Jake turned to see another human, a girl about his age with short brown hair and kind eyes. She wore the same gray uniform that Jake had been given on Earth. "Yes," Jake said. "I'm Jake Harrison from Earth." "I'm Lisa Murphy," she said with a smile. "Also from Earth. We're probably the only humans here. The Academy only takes 3 humans every year, and I heard the 3rd one got sick and couldn't come." Jake nodded. He had heard the same thing. Out of billions of humans on Earth, only 3 were chosen each year to attend the Galactic Military Academy. The selection process had been harder than anything Jake had ever done. Physical tests, mental challenges, and interviews that lasted for days. When the letter came saying he was accepted, his family could barely believe it. The line moved forward. And soon Jake and Lisa stepped out of the transport into a huge hallway. The ceiling was so high that Jake could barely see it. Aliens of every size and shape walked in all directions. Some moved on legs, others floated in the air, and a few seemed to slide along the floor like liquid. "Welcome to Kepler Station," announced a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "New cadets, please report to Section 7 for processing." Jake and Lisa followed the signs through corridor after corridor. The walls were covered with pictures of famous battles and legendary soldiers from different worlds. Jake recognized some human faces among them, but most were alien. He wondered if he would ever be good enough to have his picture on these walls. They reached a large room where dozens of new cadets were gathering. Jake saw beings he had only read about in books. There was a creature that looked like it was made of living metal, another that seemed to be made of pure energy, and one that kept changing colors like a chameleon. "Attention, new cadets!" boomed a voice that made everyone stop talking. A massive blue creature with 4 arms walked into the room. He was at least 8 feet tall, with skin that looked like it was made of armor. His eyes were yellow and seemed to look right through Jake. "I am Drill Sergeant Vextala of the Zentari Empire. For the next 4 months, I will be your trainer, your teacher, and your worst nightmare." Jake felt his heart beating faster. He had read about the Zentari in his preparation books. They were known as the best soldiers in the galaxy, and their training methods were legendary for being impossibly hard. "You come from many worlds," Vextala continued, walking slowly through the crowd. "Some of you are strong. Some are fast. Some have special abilities that others can only dream of. But here, none of that matters. Here you will learn to be soldiers." The drill sergeant stopped in front of Jake. His yellow eyes stared down at the young human for what felt like forever. "And some of you," he said quietly, "will learn that you do not belong here at all." Jake tried to stand straighter, but he felt very small next to the huge alien. Vextala moved on, continuing his speech about the Academy's rules and expectations. Jake tried to listen, but his mind kept thinking about those yellow eyes and what they might mean. After the speech, the cadets were divided into groups. Jake found himself assigned to Training Group Delta along with Lisa and 8 other beings. Their group leader was a smaller Zentari named Kickster, who seemed almost friendly compared to Vextala. "Follow me," Kickster said. "I will show you too. Your quarters and give you your schedules." As they walked through more corridors, Jake got his first good look at his fellow cadets. There was Crix, who looked like a walking boulder with glowing red eyes. When he spoke, his voice sounded like rocks grinding together. Next to him was Zara, a green creature that moved like a snake but walked on 2 legs. Her movements were so smooth and fast that Jake could barely follow them with his eyes. The strangest member of their group was Nix, who seemed to be made of silver light. Sometimes Jake could see through him, and sometimes he looked solid. When Nix spoke, his voice seemed to come from inside Jake's head rather than from his mouth. "So these are the famous humans," said a voice that sounded like wind through trees. Jake turned to see a tall, thin being with skin like bark and leaves for hair. "I am Groot of the Forest Worlds. I have heard much about your species." "Good things, I hope," Lisa said with a nervous laugh. Groot's wooden features moved in what might have been a smile. "Your people are said to be very creative. Some say too creative for your own good." Before Jake could ask what that meant, they arrived at their quarters. The rooms were small but comfortable, with beds that could adjust to fit different body types. Jake was relieved to see that his room had normal human furniture and air that he could breathe without special equipment. "Rest tonight," Kickster told them. "Tomorrow your real training begins. You will learn quickly that the Academy does not accept weakness. Those who cannot keep up will be sent home." As the others went to their rooms, Jake stood in the hallway for a moment, looking out another window at the stars. Earth was somewhere out there, but he could not see it. He had never felt so far from home. "Nervous?" Lisa asked, coming up beside him. "A little," Jake admitted. "Everyone here seems to have some kind of special ability. Crix is incredibly strong, Zara is super fast, and Nix can read minds. What do we have?" Lisa was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said finally. "But we must have something, or they wouldn't have chosen us." Jake hoped she was right. He had always been good at solving problems and thinking of new ways to do things. His teachers on Earth had called him creative and adaptable, but surrounded by beings who could lift boulders or move faster than the eye could see, those skills seemed very small. That night, Jake lay in his bed staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, he could hear the strange sounds of his alien roommates. Crix's breathing sounded like a slow avalanche, and sometimes he heard Nix's voice in his head. Though he could not understand the words, Jake thought about his family. Back on Earth, probably sleeping under the same stars that he could see from his window. His mother had cried when he left, and his father had told him to make humanity proud. Jake hoped he would not disappoint them. Tomorrow would bring his first real test at the Academy. He did not know what to expect, but he knew it would be harder than anything he had ever faced. All around him, aliens with incredible abilities were probably having the same thoughts. But Jake had one advantage that none of them knew about yet. He was human, and humans never gave up. Jake woke up to the sound of a loud alarm that hurt his ears. Red lights flashed in his room, and a voice spoke from hidden speakers in the walls. "All cadets report to Training Bay 7 in 15 minutes. Failure to arrive on time will result in immediate dismissal from the Academy." Jake jumped out of bed and quickly put on his training uniform. The gray fabric felt strange against his skin, and the boots were heavier than anything he had worn on Earth. He grabbed his water bottle and ran out into the hallway. The other cadets were already moving toward the training bay. Crix moved slowly, but his heavy footsteps shook the floor with each step. Zara moved so fast that Jake could barely see her green form as she passed him. Nix seemed to float rather than walk, and his silver light left a faint trail in the air. Behind him, "Wait up," Lisa called from behind. She was struggling to keep up with the others, just like Jake. Training Bay 7 was enormous, bigger than any building Jake had ever seen on Earth. The ceiling was so high that clouds seemed to form near the top. The floor was covered with strange symbols that glowed with different colors. In the center of the room stood a massive metal structure that looked like a doorway to another world. Drill Sergeant Vextala stood waiting for them, his 4 arms crossed and his yellow eyes watching every cadet as they arrived. Next to him stood several other Zentari officers, all looking just as serious and frightening. "Today," Vextala announced in his booming voice, "you will face the survival crucible. This is not a game. This is not practice. This is a test that will separate the warriors from the weaklings." Jake felt his stomach twist with nervousness. Around him, the other cadets stood straighter, trying to look brave. but Jake could see that many of them were scared too. The survival crucible is a holographic simulation, Vextala continued. It will test every skill you claim to have: combat, survival, problem-solving, and mental strength. The simulation contains 4 different environments, each more dangerous than the last. One of the other Zentari officers stepped forward. The current record for completing the crucible is 5 hours and 47 minutes, set by a Zentari cadet 10 years ago. Most of you will not finish at all, Jake's heart sank. 5 hours and 47 minutes seemed impossible. He looked around at his fellow cadets and saw the same worry in their faces. However, Vextala said with what might have been a smile, you will have the chance to study the simulation parameters and plan your approach. You have 1 hour to prepare before the first cadet enters the crucible. The cadets were led to a smaller room where they could access computer terminals that showed information about the simulation. Jake sat down at one of the terminals and began to read. The first environment was an urban combat zone. Ruined buildings, enemy soldiers, and hidden traps everywhere. The goal was to reach an extraction point while avoiding or defeating hostile forces. Most cadets took 2 to 3 hours to complete this section. The second environment was zero-gravity combat in space. Cadets had to navigate through a field of floating debris while fighting off enemy ships. The lack of gravity made movement very difficult, and many cadets got sick from the disorientation. The third environment was underwater. Cadets had to swim through a flooded facility while avoiding dangerous sea creatures and finding air pockets to breathe. The water was cold and dark, and the pressure made it hard to move. The final environment was described as hostile alien terrain. The information was limited, but it mentioned creatures that could change shape, poisonous plants, and a deadly atmosphere. No cadet had ever completed this section in less than 2 hours. This is impossible, Lisa whispered to Jake. How are we supposed to survive all of that? Jake looked around at the other cadets. They were all discussing their plans with confidence. Crix was flexing his massive stone muscles and talking about smashing through walls. Zara was practicing her lightning-fast movements and boasting about how she could outrun any enemy. Mix was sitting silently, his silver form flickering as he used his telepathic abilities to scan the room. What's your plan? Asked Groot, the tree-like being. His wooden face looked worried. I don't know yet, Jake admitted. What about you? Groot's leaves rustled. My people are strong and can survive in harsh environments, but we are not fast, and we do not like violence. I fear this test was not made for beings like me. Jake felt sorry for Groot. The tree being seemed kind and gentle, nothing like the fierce warriors that the Academy wanted to train. But then Jake realized something. If Groot was worried about the test, then maybe the other cadets were worried. Too, even if they didn't show it, he looked more carefully at his fellow cadets. Crix was strong, but he was also slow and clumsy. Zara was fast, but she was also small and not very strong. Nyx had telepathic powers, but his physical form seemed fragile. Each of them had great abilities, but they also had weaknesses. Attention, cadets, Vextala's voice boomed through the room. Preparation time is over. We will begin the crucible now. Who will go first? The room became very quiet. No one wanted to be the first to try the impossible test. I will go, said a voice that surprised everyone. It was Torx, a red-skinned being with 6 arms and eyes that could see in all directions. He was known as one of the best fighters in their group. Torx walked confidently to the metal doorway. The Zentari officers activated the holographic system, and the doorway filled with swirling light. Torx stepped through and disappeared. The cadets gathered around viewing screens that showed Torx's progress in the simulation. At first, he did well. His 6 arms allowed him to use multiple weapons at once, and his all-around vision helped him spot enemies quickly. But as the simulation continued, Jake could see that Torx was getting tired. His movements became slower, and he started making mistakes. After 3 hours, Torx was trapped in a collapsed building in the urban environment. He had run out of ammunition and was surrounded by enemy soldiers. The simulation ended with a red light, meaning he had failed. Torx stumbled out of the doorway, his red skin pale and his breathing heavy. "It's harder than it looks," he said. To the other cadets, much harder. 3 more cadets tried the crucible over the next hour. A flying creature with razor-sharp claws made it to the zero-gravity section before getting confused by the lack of up and down. A shapeshifter who could become invisible failed in the underwater section when he couldn't hold his breath long enough. A being made of living crystal cracked under the pressure of the urban combat zone. Each failure made the remaining cadets more nervous. Jake could see the fear in their eyes, and he felt it in his own heart too. "Next," Vextala called. Jake looked. Around, most of the cadets were avoiding eye contact with the drill sergeant, hoping someone else would volunteer. But Jake knew that waiting wouldn't make the test any easier. "I'll go," Jake said, standing up. The other cadets stared at him in surprise. Lisa grabbed his arm. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "You saw what happened to the others." Jake nodded. "Someone has to do it. And waiting won't make it easier." Vextala's yellow eyes focused on Jake. "The human volunteers. How interesting." His voice carried a tone that Jake didn't like. "Very well. Enter the crucible." Jake walked toward the metal doorway. His legs felt weak, and his heart was beating so fast that he could hear it in his ears. Behind him, he could hear the other cadets whispering. "He's brave," someone said. "He's crazy," said another voice. "He's human," said a third. "They're all a little crazy." Jake stopped in front of the doorway. The swirling light inside looked like a gateway to another world. He took a deep breath and thought about his family on Earth. His mother had always told him that being brave didn't mean not being scared. It meant doing what needed to be done even when you were scared. "Good luck," Vextala said behind him. But his voice didn't sound like he believed Jake had any chance of success. Jake stepped forward into the light. The world around him changed, and suddenly he was standing in a ruined city with the sound of gunfire in the distance. The survival crucible had begun. Jake found himself standing in the middle of a destroyed city. Broken buildings rose around him like giant tombstones, their windows shattered and walls crumbling. The sky was gray and filled with smoke. The sound of gunfire echoed from somewhere in the distance, and Jake could smell burning metal and concrete. A red light flashed in the corner of his vision, and words appeared in the air in front of him. Objective: reach the extraction point. Time remaining: unlimited. Enemy forces: active. Jake looked around carefully. The other cadets had charged forward, trying to fight their way through the enemy soldiers. But Jake had watched them fail, and he knew that approach wouldn't work. He needed to think differently. He noticed that the buildings weren't just randomly destroyed. There was a pattern to the damage. Some walls had been blown outward, which meant explosions had happened inside. Other buildings had collapsed in ways that suggested they had been hit from above. Jake realized that the enemy forces weren't just randomly placed either. They were positioned to control the main streets and obvious paths instead of running down the street like the others had done. Jake moved carefully along the edges of the ruins. He stayed low and used the broken walls and scattered debris for cover. When he heard footsteps, he stopped and waited until they passed. After 10 minutes of careful movement, Jake found what he was looking for. A building that had been hit by an explosion but was still mostly standing. He climbed through a hole in the wall and made his way to the upper floors. From there, he could see the entire combat zone. The enemy soldiers were positioned exactly where Jake had expected. They controlled the main roads and were waiting for cadets to come running toward them. But Jake also noticed something else. The soldiers weren't watching the rooftops very carefully. They expected ground-level attacks, not someone moving above them. Jake spent another 5 minutes studying the enemy positions and the layout of the city. Then he began to move from building to building, using broken bridges and collapsed sections to create his own path through the air. It was dangerous, and several times he almost fell. But it was also much faster than fighting through the streets. As he moved, Jake picked up pieces of broken equipment and debris. Other cadets had ignored these items, but Jake saw possibilities. A piece of metal pipe became a tool for prying open doors. A broken communication device still had a working battery that Jake could use. Even chunks of concrete became useful when Jake figured out how to use them to trigger traps from a safe distance. When Jake reached a building near the extraction point, he found his path blocked by a group of enemy soldiers. They were guarding the only bridge that led to his destination. Jake watched them for several minutes, noting their patrol patterns and how they communicated with each other. Instead of fighting them directly, Jake used the broken communication device to create a distraction. He rigged it to make noise on the other side of the building, then threw concrete chunks to make it sound like someone was moving around. The soldiers went to investigate, leaving the bridge unguarded for just long enough for Jake to cross. The extraction point was a glowing circle in the center of a small plaza. Jake reached it in exactly 23 minutes, faster than any of the other cadets had completed even half of the urban section. As soon as Jake stepped into the circle, the ruined city disappeared. He found himself floating in empty space, surrounded by stars and the wreckage of destroyed spaceships. This was the zero-gravity section, and Jake immediately felt his stomach lurch as his body tried to figure out which way was up. Most of the other cadets had gotten sick during this part, losing precious time while they struggled with the disorientation, but Jake had prepared for this. During his preparation hour, he had read about how zero-gravity affected the human inner ear. He closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, letting his body adjust to the strange sensation. When he opened his eyes, Jake felt much better. He was still floating, but he no longer felt like the world was spinning around him. The objective appeared in front of him again. Navigate to the space station, avoid enemy fighters, time remaining unlimited. Jake could see the space station in the distance, a massive structure with docking bays and defensive turrets. Between him and the station was a field of floating debris from destroyed ships. Enemy fighters patrolled the area, their engines glowing red as they searched for targets. Other cadets had tried to fly straight toward the station, but they had been spotted and shot down by the enemy fighters. Jake realized that he needed to use the debris field to his advantage. The wreckage would provide cover, but it would also hide the enemy ships from his view. Jake began to move through the debris field, using pieces of wreckage to push himself from one hiding spot to another. In zero gravity, he didn't need to be strong to move large objects. He just needed to understand how momentum worked in space. As Jake moved, he started to notice patterns in how the enemy fighters patrolled. They moved in predictable routes, and they had blind spots where their sensors couldn't detect movement. Jake began to time his movements to match their patrol patterns, staying hidden when they were close and moving quickly when they were far away. But Jake also realized something that the other cadets had missed. The enemy fighters weren't just randomly patrolling. They were protecting something. Jake followed their movement patterns and discovered that they were guarding a specific piece of wreckage that looked different from the others. Jake carefully approached the special wreckage and found that it contained working weapons and equipment. The simulation had hidden supplies throughout the debris field, but most cadets had been too focused on reaching the station to notice them. Jake gathered the equipment and used it to create a diversion. He rigged one of the weapons to fire automatically from a piece of wreckage on the far side of the debris field. When the enemy fighters went to investigate, Jake used the opportunity to reach the space station safely. The zero-gravity section took Jake only 18 minutes to complete. Another record-breaking time. The space station disappeared, and Jake found himself underwater in a flooded facility. The water was cold and dark, and Jake could barely see his hands in front of his face. Emergency lights flickered weakly in the distance, casting strange shadows on the walls. Jake's lungs were already starting to burn, and he knew he would need to find air soon. The objective appeared, glowing weakly in the dark water. Escape the flooded facility. Find the surface. Time remaining unlimited. Other cadets had panicked during this section, swimming frantically and using up their air too quickly. But Jake had grown up near the ocean on Earth, and he knew how to conserve his breath underwater. He also knew that panic was his worst enemy. Jake swam slowly and steadily, conserving his energy and air. He followed the emergency lights, reasoning that they would lead to important areas of the facility. As he swam, he looked for signs of where the facility had been before it flooded. Jake found what he was looking for in an office area. Maps on the walls showed the layout of the facility, including the location of emergency air pockets and escape routes. Other cadets had ignored these clues, but Jake studied them carefully, even though his lungs were burning. The map showed that the facility had multiple levels, and not all of them were completely flooded. Jake swam upward and found air pockets where he could breathe and rest. He also found emergency equipment that had been designed to help people escape from flooded areas. Using the maps and equipment, Jake was able to navigate through the facility much more efficiently than the other cadets. He avoided the dangerous areas where sea creatures lurked, and he found shortcuts that saved him precious air and time. When Jake finally reached the surface, he had completed the underwater section in only 15 minutes. He floated on his back for a moment, breathing the fresh air and feeling proud of what he had accomplished. But as the water disappeared around him, Jake realized that he had only completed 3 sections of the crucible. The final section was still waiting for him, and according to the information he had read, it was the most dangerous of all. Jake found himself standing in a strange landscape that looked like no world he had ever seen. The sky was purple, and the ground was covered with plants that seemed to move on their own. In the distance, he could see creatures that shifted and changed shape as they moved. This was the hostile alien terrain, and Jake knew that this was where his real test would begin. Jake stood at the edge of the alien landscape and tried to understand what he was seeing. The ground beneath his feet felt soft and squishy, like walking on a giant sponge. The plants around him were unlike anything on Earth. Some looked like trees but had tentacles instead of branches. Others seemed to be watching him with what looked like eyes growing from their stems. The purple sky above him pulsed with strange light, and Jake could taste something metallic in the air. The objective appeared in front of him, glowing against the weird scenery. Reach the extraction point. Survive the hostile environment. Warning: atmosphere contains mild toxins. Breathing apparatus recommended. Jake felt his throat starting to burn slightly from the poisonous air. He knew he couldn't stay in this environment for too long, but he also knew he couldn't rush. The other cadets who had reached this section had made mistakes, because they panicked about the toxic air. Jake looked around carefully and noticed something strange. Some of the plants were moving, but not all of them. The ones that moved seemed to react to sound and movement, while others stayed perfectly still. Jake realized that some of the plants might not be plants at all. They might be creatures pretending to be plants. He picked up a small rock and threw it at a nearby bush. The bush immediately sprouted legs and ran away, making a sound like a frightened bird. Jake smiled grimly. The simulation was full of creatures that used camouflage, just like some animals on Earth. Jake began to move through the alien landscape, testing each plant before he got too close. He threw rocks, made noise, and watched for reactions. Soon he could tell the difference between real plants and the creatures that were hiding. The fake plants moved slightly when they breathed, and their colors were just a little bit different from the real ones. As Jake walked deeper into the alien terrain, he started to notice other things. The real plants had patterns in how they grew. They needed light and water, just like plants on Earth. The fake plants, the creatures in disguise, didn't follow these patterns. They were positioned to ambush anything that walked by. Jake also noticed that the toxic air wasn't the same. Everywhere near some of the real plants, the air was cleaner. These plants were probably filtering the toxins, making the air safer to breathe. Jake began to plan his route to stay near these plants as much as possible, but the biggest challenge was still ahead. According to the information Jake had read, somewhere in this alien landscape was a creature that hunted other beings. It was fast, strong, and nearly impossible to detect. Every cadet who had reached this section had been caught by this creature. Jake had been walking for about 10 minutes when he heard a sound behind him. It was soft, like the whisper of wind through grass. But there was no wind in the simulation, and Jake had learned to pay attention to details that others missed. He turned around slowly and saw nothing. but the grass behind him was bent in a way that suggested something heavy had stepped on it. Jake picked up another rock and threw it at the spot. The rock hit something invisible and bounced off. The creature hunting him could turn invisible, but it couldn't hide its weight or the sounds it made. Jake realized that this was both the creature's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It was used to being invisible, which probably made it careless about other ways it could be detected. Jake continued walking, but now he was listening for every sound and watching for every bent blade of grass. He also started to understand the creature's behavior. It was following him, but it wasn't attacking immediately. It was probably waiting for the right moment when Jake was tired or distracted. Jake decided to use this against the creature. He pretended to be more tired than he really was, walking slower and stopping to rest more often. He also pretended not to notice the signs that the creature was following him. As Jake walked, he began to collect things from the environment. A sharp piece of crystal that had fallen from one of the strange trees. A sticky sap that oozed from some of the plants. Vines that were strong enough to use as rope. Other cadets had ignored these items, but Jake saw them as tools. Jake also noticed that the alien landscape had its own geography. There were hills and valleys, streams of liquid that might not be water, and areas where the ground was harder or softer. Most importantly, there were places where the toxic air was thicker and places where it was thinner. After 20 minutes of walking, Jake found what he was looking for. A narrow valley where the toxic air was very thick. The valley had only one way in and one way out, and the walls were steep and covered with the sharp crystals he had been collecting. Jake walked into the valley and sat down in the middle, pretending to rest. He could hear the invisible creature following him, its footsteps soft but not silent. Jake waited until he was sure the creature was close. Then he put his plan into action. Jake had used the sticky sap to attach sharp crystals to the vines he had collected. He had also found spots on the valley walls where he could anchor the vines. When the creature moved closer, Jake suddenly jumped up and began throwing rocks at specific points around the valley. The creature, confused by the sudden noise and movement, became visible for just a moment. Jake saw it clearly now. It was about the size of a large dog, with skin that could change color like a chameleon. It had too many teeth and claws that looked like they could cut through metal, but Jake had expected this. He pulled on the vines he had set up and his trap activated. The sharp crystals swung across the valley at just the right height. The creature tried to dodge, but the valley was too narrow and the crystals were positioned too well. The creature wasn't hurt badly, but it was confused and angry. It became visible again and charged directly at Jake. This was exactly what Jake had hoped for. He ran toward the thickest part of the toxic air, where breathing was most difficult. Jake had trained his lungs during his time on Earth, swimming in the ocean and running in the mountains. He could hold his breath longer than most humans, and he could function even when breathing was difficult. But the creature, which had lived its whole life in this environment, had never learned to deal with thick toxic air. The creature began to slow down as the poison affected its breathing. Jake, holding his breath, ran through the thickest part of the toxic cloud and came out the other side. The creature tried to follow, but it was coughing and struggling to breathe. Jake didn't wait to see what happened next. He ran out of the valley and continued toward the extraction point. Behind him, he could hear the creature struggling, but it was no longer following him. The extraction point was on top of a hill covered with the real plants that cleaned the air. Jake climbed the hill carefully, still watching for hidden creatures and testing each plant before he got too close. The air became cleaner as he climbed, and his throat stopped burning. When Jake reached the top of the hill, he saw a glowing circle just like the ones in the other sections. But this time, something was different. The circle was surrounded by a group of the shape-shifting creatures, all pretending to be plants. Jake realized that this was the final test. He had to reach the extraction point, but it was guarded by creatures that could look like anything. Other cadets had probably been caught by surprise when the fake plants around the extraction point revealed themselves to be enemies. But Jake had learned to tell the difference between real plants and fake ones. He also had his collection of crystals, vines, and other tools. Most importantly, he had something that the simulation hadn't expected. Jake had learned to think like the creatures in the simulation. He understood their behavior, their weaknesses, and their patterns. And now he was going to use that knowledge to finish what he had started. Jake took a deep breath of the clean air and began to plan his final approach to the extraction point. He had come too far to fail now. Jake studied the extraction point carefully. The glowing circle was surrounded by 12 plants, but Jake could tell that at least 8 of them were actually creatures in disguise. They were positioned too perfectly, like soldiers guarding a fortress. Real plants would have grown in more random patterns. Jake counted his remaining tools. He had 3 sharp crystals, 2 lengths of vine, and a small amount of sticky sap left. He also had the knowledge he had gained about how these creatures behaved. It would have to be enough. Jake noticed that the fake plants were all watching the obvious approaches to the extraction point. They expected him to try to sneak around them or fight through them. But Jake had learned something important during his time in the simulation. The best solutions often came from doing something unexpected, instead of trying to avoid the creatures. Jake walked directly toward them. But as he walked, he made himself look like he was injured and tired. He limped slightly and breathed heavily. As if the toxic air had affected him more than it really had, the creatures saw him coming and tensed, ready to attack. But Jake wasn't moving like a threat. He was moving like prey that was already defeated. The creatures relaxed slightly, confident that they could catch him easily. When Jake was about 10 feet away from the extraction point, he suddenly threw all 3 of his remaining crystals in different directions. The crystals made noise as they landed, and the creatures turned to look at them. For just a moment, their attention was divided. Jake used that moment to run directly toward the extraction point. 2 of the creatures tried to intercept him, revealing themselves as they dropped their plant disguises. But Jake had expected this. He used his remaining vines to trip one creature and rolled past the other. Jake dove toward the glowing circle, his hand reaching out to touch the light. But just as his fingers were about to make contact, something grabbed his ankle. One of the creatures had caught him at the last second. Jake looked back and saw a creature that looked like a cross between a spider and a snake. It had multiple legs and a long body covered in scales that changed color to match the ground. Its grip was strong, and Jake could feel its claws digging into his leg. For a moment, Jake thought he was going to fail. After everything he had accomplished, he was going to be caught just inches away from completing the simulation. But then he remembered something his father had told him before he left Earth. When you can't go forward, sometimes you have to go backward to find a new way. Instead of trying to pull away from the creature, Jake pushed himself back toward it. The creature was surprised by this move and loosened its grip slightly. Jake used that moment to grab a handful of the sticky sap he had collected earlier. Jake smeared the sap on the creature's legs, making them stick to the ground. The creature struggled to free itself, but the sap held it in place. Jake pulled free and lunged forward, his hand finally touching the glowing circle. The alien landscape disappeared instantly. Jake found himself back in Training Bay 7, standing in the metal doorway. The room was completely silent. Every cadet, every instructor, every Zentari officer was staring at him in shock. Jake looked at the clock on the wall. He had been in the simulation for exactly 58 minutes and 23 seconds. He had completed the survival crucible in less than an hour, something that no one had ever done before. Drill Sergeant Vextala stood frozen, his 4 arms hanging at his sides and his yellow eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at the control panel, then at Jake, then back at the control panel. He pressed several buttons and checked the readings 3 times. "This is impossible," Vextala said quietly. "The simulation records show that you completed all 4 sections, but the time ... He shook his head. "The time cannot be correct." One of the other Zentari officers ran a full diagnostic on the simulation system. "The equipment is functioning perfectly," he reported. "The time is accurate." The human completed the survival crucible in 58 minutes and 23 seconds. The other cadets began to whisper among themselves. Jake heard fragments of their conversations. How did he do it? He's just a human. He doesn't have any special abilities. Maybe that's exactly why he succeeded. Vextala walked slowly toward Jake, his expression unreadable. When he reached the young human, he stopped and looked down at him for a long moment. Explain, Vextala said simply. Jake took a deep breath. The other cadets who tried the simulation all used their special abilities. They relied on strength or speed or telepathy, but the simulation was designed to counter those abilities. It was made to defeat specialists. Jake paused, trying to find the right words. Humans don't have one great ability. We have something different. We can adapt. We can look at a problem and find a solution that no one else has thought of. Vextala tilted his head. Continue. In the urban section, everyone else tried to fight the enemy soldiers. But I realized that fighting wasn't the objective. Getting to the extraction point was the objective. So I found a way to do that without fighting. Jake began to pace as he explained, his confidence growing. In the zero-gravity section, everyone else got sick because they fought against the weightlessness. I let my body adjust to it. I also noticed that the enemy fighters were protecting something, so I used that to my advantage. And the underwater section? Asked one of the other instructors. I grew up near the ocean on Earth. I knew how to conserve air and stay calm underwater. But more importantly, I looked for clues about the facility's layout instead of just swimming randomly. Vextala's expression was starting to change. The surprise was being replaced by something that looked like respect. And the final section, the hostile alien terrain? Jake smiled slightly. That was the hardest part. But I realized that all the creatures there followed patterns. Just like animals on Earth, the shapeshifters weren't random. They had behaviors and weaknesses. Once I understood that, I could predict what they would do. The invisible predator. Vextala said, How did you defeat it? I didn't defeat it, Jake said. I understood it. It was used to being invisible, which made it careless about other ways it could be detected. I also realized that it had never learned to handle thick, toxic air because it had always lived in this environment. So I used its strength against it. The room was completely silent now. Even the other cadets had stopped whispering. Everyone was listening to Jake's explanation. But how did you know all of this would work? Asked Crix the stone-like being. You had never seen these environments before? Jake thought about the question. I didn't know it would work. But I knew that doing the same thing as everyone else wouldn't work because I had watched them fail. So I had to try something different. Vextala nodded slowly. You turned your weaknesses into strengths. You used your lack of special abilities as an advantage. Yes, Jake said. Every species here has incredible natural abilities. But sometimes those abilities become limitations. You expect your strength to solve problems, so you don't look for other solutions. You rely on your speed so you don't take time to plan. You trust your telepathy so you don't observe with your other senses. Jake looked around at his fellow cadets. Humans don't have those limitations because we don't have those abilities. We have to find new ways to solve problems. We have to be creative. Vextala was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He bowed to Jake, a gesture of respect that Zentari rarely showed to anyone. In 200 years of training soldiers, Vextala said, I have never seen anything like what you accomplished today. You have shown me that there are different kinds of strength and different ways to be a warrior. The drill sergeant straightened up and looked at the other cadets. This human has taught us all something important. In a galaxy where every species has found their specialty, perhaps the greatest strength is the ability to find new specialties when you need them. Jake felt a warm feeling in his chest. He had not only completed the impossible test, but he had also earned the respect of the toughest instructor in the academy. More importantly, he had proven that humans belonged here, not despite their limitations, but because of how they dealt with them. Tomorrow, Vextala announced, we will begin advanced tactical training. And I believe we have much to learn from our human cadet about thinking in new ways. As the other cadets gathered around Jake, Asking questions and offering congratulations, Jake looked up at the stars visible through the training bay windows. Somewhere out there was Earth and his family who had believed in him. He had made them proud, and he had made humanity proud, but most importantly, Jake had discovered something about himself and his species. Humans might not be the strongest, or the fastest, or the most telepathic, but they were something else entirely. They were the species that never accepted that there was only one way to solve a problem, and in a galaxy full of specialists, that might just be the most valuable ability of all.